Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will completely shatter everything you think you know about love, dating, and relationships. Imagine this. You're 12 years old and you wake up one morning to find your parents have already chosen who you're going to spend the rest of your life with. You've never met this person. You don't know their name, but in 3 months, you'll be married to them, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Now imagine that holding hands with someone you actually like could get you publicly flogged in the town square, that writing a love letter could literally get you executed, that even dreaming about someone romantically could have you burned at the stake for witchcraft. Welcome to medieval dating, where finding love wasn't just complicated, it was more dangerous than going to war. I'm about to take you through 15 absolutely insane dating rules from the Middle Ages that would completely destroy every modern relationship. And I promise you, by the time we get to rule number 9, you'll be thanking God you were born in the 21st century instead of the 12th. But before we dive into this medieval nightmare, if you're new here, I create deep dives into the darkest, most shocking parts of history that nobody talks about. So hit that subscribe button because trust me, after tonight's journey through medieval romance, you're going to want to see what other historical horrors I uncover. And if this video blows your mind, which it absolutely will, smash that like button to help more people discover just how brutal our ancestors' love lives really were. Alright, let's start with the foundation of this romantic nightmare. The very first rule that governed medieval love, and honestly, it's so shocking that it makes every helicopter parent in 2025 look like they're giving their kids complete freedom. Think helicopter parents are bad. Medieval parents could literally sell your heart to the highest bidder, and it was completely legal. Here's something that will blow your mind in medieval Europe. 90% of all marriages were arranged before the children even hit puberty. We're talking about 7-year-olds being promised to complete strangers, often people they would never meet until their actual wedding day. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually worked, because the reality is so much worse than anything you've seen in movies or TV shows. Meet Isabella. She's 12 years old, living in 13th century France. She wakes up on what she thinks is going to be a normal Tuesday morning. She's thinking about playing with her dolls, maybe helping her mother with some sewing. Instead, her father walks into her room and says, "Isabella, pack your belongings. You're getting married next month to Lord Geoffrey. He's 45 years old, has 3 dead wives already, and lives 200 miles away. You'll meet him at the altar," and that was it. No discussion. No, what do you think? No, are you ready for this? Because Isabella wasn't a person with thoughts and feelings, she was property. Literally, legally, property. The betrothal contracts from this period read exactly like livestock sales agreements. I'm not exaggerating. Historians have found medieval marriage contracts that list the bride right alongside cattle, pigs, and sheep as items being transferred from one family to another. Here's what a typical betrothal contract looked like. For the sum of 50 silver marks, 12 cows, 8 pigs, 1 mill, and the girl Isabella, aged 12 years, Lord Geoffrey shall receive. The girl was just another asset on a balance sheet. But it gets worse. Way worse. Parents didn't just arrange these marriages. They calculated their children's romantic value like we calculate stock prices today. A beautiful daughter was worth more cows. A daughter with a slight physical defect, her price dropped immediately. A daughter who was too smart or too independent, actually worth less because she might cause trouble for her future husband. And the age thing. 7 years old was actually considered the ideal age to arrange a marriage, because the younger the child, the less likely they were to develop their own preferences or personality that might interfere with the family's business plans. I found this absolutely horrifying record from 1287 where a father sold his 8-year-old daughter to a 52-year-old merchant. The contract specifically states that the girl shall be delivered immediately upon her first bleeding, meaning they were literally waiting for this child to hit puberty so they could hand her over to this middle-aged stranger. The craziest part, children who refused these arrangements weren't just disobedient, they were considered criminals. There are court records of 14-year-olds being thrown in prison for refusing to marry the person their parents chose. Some were disowned and left to starve on the streets. Others were beaten until they agreed to the marriage. Let me tell you about what happened to Lady Margaret of Wessex in 1294. She was 15 and refused to marry the 67-year-old duke her father had chosen. Her punishment: she was locked in a tower for 8 months with nothing but bread and water until she agreed to the marriage. When she finally gave in, she was so weak she had to be carried to the altar. But here's what really shows you how different this was from anything we understand today. Parents didn't see this as cruel. They genuinely believed they were doing the best thing for their children. Love was considered a luxury that poor people couldn't afford and rich people couldn't risk. A 13th century parenting manual, yes, these actually existed, states: a child who marries for love brings shame upon their family and invites God's wrath upon their household. Parents who allow their children to choose their own spouses are guilty of the sin of pride and will answer to God for their negligence. The economic calculations behind these arrangements were incredibly sophisticated. Families had detailed charts showing exactly how much different types of children were worth in different marriage markets. A firstborn son could command the highest bride price. A second son was worth significantly less. A third son often couldn't marry at all unless he joined the church. For girls, the calculations were even more brutal. Beauty, health, and family connections determined everything. But here's something that will shock you. Intelligence in a girl actually decreased her marriage value. There are records of fathers lying about their daughters' education levels to make them more attractive to potential husbands. Regional differences made this system even more complex. In England, a merchant family needed at least 100 silver marks to marry their daughter to minor nobility. In France, that same marriage might cost 200 marks. In the Germanic regions, daughters were often traded for military alliances rather than money. The legal framework supporting this was ironclad. Children had absolutely no legal rights when it came to marriage. Zero. None. The concept that a child might have an opinion about their own life partner was not just ignored. It was considered a dangerous and heretical idea that threatened the foundation of Christian society. And here's perhaps the most disturbing part. This system created a generation of adults who had never experienced love or affection in their marriages, so they genuinely didn't understand what they were taking away from their own children. It was a cycle of emotional deprivation that lasted for centuries. When I compare this to modern parenting, it's almost impossible to comprehend. Today, if parents tried to sell their 12-year-old daughter to a middle-aged stranger, they'd be arrested for human trafficking. But in medieval times, not arranging your child's marriage was considered neglectful parenting. This makes every modern helicopter parent look like they're giving their kids complete and total freedom. At least helicopter parents today want their kids to be happy. They're just overprotective about how that happiness happens. Medieval parents didn't care about their children's happiness at all. They cared about family honour, economic advantage, and political alliances. The psychological damage this caused is something historians are only now beginning to understand. Imagine never having the experience of falling in love, of choosing someone because they make you laugh, or because you enjoy their company. Imagine your most intimate relationship being with someone who was essentially purchased for you like a piece of furniture. But if you think parental control was the worst part of medieval dating, you haven't seen anything yet. Because there was another institution that had even more power over your love life than your own family. An institution that monitored every conversation, every glance, every romantic thought you might have. An institution that could, and regularly did, sentence people to death for the crime of falling in love with the wrong person. That institution was the Catholic Church, and when I tell you they controlled every single aspect of medieval romance, I mean every single aspect. Swipe right in medieval times. That's not just a bad idea, that's a one-way ticket to hell. Literally. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. The Catholic Church controlled 95% of all romantic decisions in medieval Europe. Not influenced, not guided, controlled. They had the legal power to approve or reject every single relationship, and if you dared to pursue love without their permission, the consequences were absolutely brutal. Let me show you exactly how this worked, because the system they created was so comprehensive, so invasive, that it makes modern surveillance look like amateur hour. First, you couldn't even think about dating someone without going through what they called spiritual compatibility assessment. This wasn't a casual conversation with your local priest. This was a full-scale investigation that could take months. The process started with something called a romantic petition. You, or more likely your parents, had to formally request permission from the church to begin courting someone. This petition had to include detailed information about both families' religious history, their financial contributions to the church, their attendance records, and even their confessional records. Yes, you heard that right. The church would review your private confessions to determine if you were spiritually worthy of love. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. The priest would then conduct separate interviews with both potential partners, and these weren't friendly chats about your hopes and dreams. These were intensive interrogations designed to root out any sign of inappropriate desire, heretical thinking, or spiritual weakness. I found this incredible document from 1298 that shows the actual questions priests were required to ask during these romantic interviews. Listen to this. Have you experienced lustful thoughts about this person? Have you imagined physical contact beyond what is holy and proper? Have you dreamed of this person in ways that would displease God? Do you seek this union for carnal pleasure or for the glory of God? And here's the kicker. If you lied during these interviews, it wasn't just a sin. It was considered perjury against God himself, punishable by excommunication or worse. Let me tell you the story of Pierre and Marguerite from 13th century France, because their experience shows you just how devastating this system could be. Pierre was a young merchant who fell in love with Marguerite, the daughter of a local craftsman. They were perfectly matched in terms of social class, age, and family background. Their parents approved of the match. By every reasonable standard, this should have been a simple, straightforward arrangement. But when they applied for church permission to court, the priest discovered that Marguerite's grandmother had once been accused of witchcraft, charges that were dropped. But the accusation was still in the church records. This made Marguerite's entire bloodline spiritually suspect. The church denied their petition. Pierre and Marguerite were forbidden from seeing each other, speaking to each other, or even being in the same room together. But they were young and in love, so they tried to meet in secret. They were caught by church informants. Yes, the church had a network of spies specifically watching for unauthorized romance, and both were sentenced to public penance. Pierre was forced to stand naked in the town square for 3 days while people threw rotten food at him. Marguerite was sent to a convent for 6 months of spiritual purification. When she emerged, she was so psychologically broken that she never spoke to another man for the rest of her life. And this wasn't an extreme case. This was Tuesday in medieval Europe. The church also controlled the timing of romance with an iron fist. There were 180 days per year when romantic activity of any kind was completely forbidden. This included all of Lent, all of Advent, every Friday, every Sunday, every Saint's Day, and dozens of other religious observances. During these forbidden periods, couples weren't just prohibited from physical contact, they couldn't even have conversations alone together. The church considered romantic discussion during holy periods to be a form of blasphemy. I discovered this fascinating record from a monastery in Germany that tracked violations of romantic timing. In just 1 year, 1342, they documented over 400 cases of couples being punished for inappropriate romantic behaviour during sacred time. The punishments ranged from public confession to imprisonment to, in extreme cases, banishment from the community. But perhaps the most invasive aspect of church control was their monitoring of religious compatibility. The church maintained detailed records of every family's religious performance going back generations. They tracked church attendance, tithing amounts, confession frequency, and even the content of private prayers. Before approving any romantic relationship, priests would cross-reference these records to ensure both families met their standards of spiritual worthiness. If your great-grandfather had missed too much church, if your aunt had been slow to pay her tithe, if your cousin had asked inappropriate questions during Bible study, any of these things could disqualify you from love. And here's something that will absolutely shock you. The church actually profited massively from this system. Every romantic petition required a processing fee. Every compatibility assessment required a consultation fee. Every approved courtship required a blessing fee. A typical middle-class family in 14th century England would spend the equivalent of 6 months' income just on church fees to get permission for their child to date someone. For wealthy families, these fees could be astronomical. Some nobles paid the equivalent of entire estates just for romantic approval. The church became incredibly wealthy from controlling love. There are financial records showing that romantic fees made up nearly 30% of total church income in some regions. Love wasn't just regulated by the church, it was a major source of their economic power. Regional variations in church strictness created a bizarre medieval dating market. Areas controlled by particularly strict bishops became known as romantic wastelands, where almost no marriages were approved. Young people would literally migrate hundreds of miles to regions with more lenient churches, just for the chance to fall in love legally. The psychological impact of this system was devastating. Imagine knowing that your most intimate feelings, your deepest desires, your hopes for companionship and love were all subject to approval by an institution that viewed romance as inherently sinful and dangerous. The church taught that love itself was a distraction from God, that physical attraction was evidence of spiritual weakness, and that the desire for companionship showed a lack of faith in divine providence. They didn't just control romance, they made people feel guilty for wanting it in the first place. And if you somehow managed to navigate through all of these religious restrictions, if you got your parental approval and your church permission and your spiritual compatibility assessment, you still faced one more brutal reality that could destroy your romantic dreams before they even began. Because medieval society had created an economic barrier to love that was so high, so impossibly expensive, that it left millions of people completely unable to afford the basic human experience of choosing their own partner, a financial requirement so crushing that families would literally bankrupt themselves, sell everything they owned, and go into debt for generations, all for the simple privilege of love. That financial requirement was the dowry system, and when I tell you it was brutal, I mean it literally prevented 40% of medieval women from ever getting married. No dowry, no husband, and I mean no husband, ever. Not eventually. Not if you waited. Not if you were beautiful or smart or kind. Without a dowry, you were essentially sentenced to a lifetime of spinsterhood, and medieval society had absolutely no mercy for unmarried women. Here's a statistic that will shock you to your core by the end of the 13th century. Nearly half of all women in Europe never married, not because they didn't want to, but because their families simply couldn't afford the dowry required to secure them a husband. And we're not talking about small amounts of money here. The dowry inflation crisis of the medieval period makes modern housing prices look reasonable by comparison. Let me break down exactly how this economic nightmare worked, because the numbers are so insane that you'll understand why families were literally destroying themselves financially just to get their daughters married. In 12th century England, a basic dowry for a merchant-class marriage was equivalent to about 3 years of a skilled craftsman's wages. By the 14th century, that same dowry had inflated to nearly 8 years of wages. Imagine having to save up 8 years of your entire salary just to give your daughter permission to get married. But it gets so much worse when you look at the class breakdown. For a peasant family, which was about 80% of the population, the minimum dowry for their daughter to marry within their own social class was still equivalent to 2 full years of family income. That's 2 years where the entire family earns money and spends absolutely nothing on food, clothing, shelter, or anything else, just to afford their daughter's marriage. For merchant families, the dowry requirements were catastrophic. A merchant's daughter looking to marry into minor nobility needed a dowry equivalent to 15 to 20 years of family income. I found records of merchant families selling their businesses, their homes, and everything they owned, and still going into debt for decades just to afford their daughter's dowry. And for noble families, the numbers become almost impossible to comprehend. A duke's daughter marrying into a royal family might require a dowry equivalent to the annual income of an entire region. We're talking about money that could fund armies, build cathedrals, or purchase entire cities. Let me tell you the story of the Benedetti family from 14th century Florence, because their experience shows you just how devastating this system could be for ordinary people. Marco Benedetti was a successful cloth merchant with 3 daughters. When his eldest daughter, Caterina, turned 16, he began looking for a suitable husband. The cheapest acceptable match he could find, A baker's son from a neighbouring town demanded a dowry of 800 florins. To put that in perspective, Marco's entire business was worth about 600 florins. He would have to sell everything he owned and still wouldn't have enough money for Caterina's dowry. So Marco made the decision that thousands of medieval fathers made he mortgaged his business, borrowed money from every relative and friend he could find, and took out loans from the church at crushing interest rates. The total debt he accumulated for Caterina's dowry was over 1,200 florins. The payment schedule was brutal. Marco had to make monthly payments that consumed 80% of his business income. His family lived on bread and water. They couldn't afford firewood in winter. His 2 younger daughters wore the same dress for 3 years because they couldn't afford new clothing. And here's the tragic ending. After 4 years of these crushing payments, Marco's business finally collapsed under the debt. He lost everything: his shop, his home, his savings. The family was reduced to begging on the streets, but Caterina was married. The system had worked exactly as designed. This story wasn't unusual. It was repeated thousands of times across medieval Europe. Families destroying themselves financially for the privilege of getting their daughters married. And what happened to the daughters who couldn't get dowries? Their options were horrifically limited. Some became servants in wealthy households, essentially slaves who worked without pay in exchange for food and shelter. Others were forced into convents, not because they had religious callings, but because convents were the only institutions that would accept women without dowries. But many simply became what medieval society called the undowryable, women who lived as permanent dependents of their families, never able to marry, never able to have children, never able to establish households of their own. They were treated as burdens, as failures, as evidence of their family's inadequacy. I found this heartbreaking letter from 1356, written by a woman named Agnes to her sister. I am now 35 years old, and still live in our father's house like a child. I have no money, no prospects, no hope of marriage. The baker's widow suggested I become a prostitute, as that is the only way a woman without a dowry can support herself. I pray daily for death to release me from this shame. The psychological impact of the dowry system was devastating, but the creative solutions that families developed were sometimes even worse than the problem itself. Some families would indenture their daughters as servants for years before marriage, with the wages going directly toward dowry accumulation. I found records of 12-year-old girls being sent away from their families to work as unpaid servants for 10-15 years, just to earn enough money for their own dowries. Other families would pool resources across multiple generations. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins would all contribute to a single daughter's dowry, meaning that one girl's marriage could financially devastate an entire extended family. Some of the most desperate families turned to what were essentially dowry loans from wealthy merchants. These loans came with interest rates of 40-60% annually, and if the family couldn't repay them, they could lose not just their money, but their freedom. Entire families were forced into indentured servitude to pay off dowry debts, but perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the dowry system was how it created a literal marketplace for women where their value was calculated with mathematical precision. Medieval families kept detailed charts showing exactly how much different types of daughters were worth in the marriage market. Beauty added 20% to the base dowry requirement. Musical ability might add 10%. Knowledge of reading and writing could add 15%, but only in merchant families. Noble families actually considered literacy in women to be a negative trait that reduced their marriage value. Physical defects reduced dowry value dramatically. A woman with a limp might need 50% more dowry to secure the same marriage as a healthy woman. A woman with scars, even from childhood accidents, could find her marriage prospects completely destroyed, and age was absolutely brutal. A woman's dowry requirement increased by about 20% per year after age 20. By age 25, she needed double the dowry. By age 30, many families simply gave up trying to marry their daughters at all. The regional variations in dowry requirements created a medieval economic migration pattern, where families would literally move hundreds of miles to areas with lower dowry costs. Northern England had much lower dowry requirements than Southern England, so families would relocate their entire lives just for the chance to afford their daughters' marriages. But even if you somehow managed to navigate the parental control, the church approval, and the financial requirements, medieval society had created physical and social restrictions around romantic contact that were so strict, so invasive, that they make modern social distancing rules look like a free-for-all, because touching someone you weren't married to, even holding hands, even accidentally brushing fingers, wasn't just inappropriate. It was considered a crime against God and society that could result in public punishment, social exile, or even death. That physical contact was considered so dangerous, so morally corrupting, that medieval society created what can only be described as a physical contact police state. And when I say police state, I mean they literally had people whose job it was to monitor and report unauthorized touching between unmarried people. Holding hands was basically medieval OnlyFans, scandalous, illegal, and guaranteed to destroy your reputation forever. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind in medieval Europe. There are documented cases of people receiving public flogging for the crime of holding hands without proper supervision. Not kissing, not anything sexual. Holding hands. Let me paint you a picture of exactly how insane this physical contact surveillance system was, because the level of control they exercised over human bodies makes modern pandemic restrictions look like complete anarchy. First, there was the chaperone system, and this wasn't just have an adult around. This was military-level escort protocol. For any interaction between unmarried people, there had to be at least 2 chaperones present at all times. These chaperones couldn't be friends, they couldn't be siblings, and they couldn't be anyone under the age of 40. They had to be morally upstanding members of the community who had been specifically approved by both families and the local church. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. The chaperones weren't just supposed to watch, they were required to maintain detailed written reports of every interaction. What was said, where people stood, how long they talked, whether there were any inappropriate glances or unseemly gestures. I found this incredible document from 1334, an actual chaperone report from a courtship in Germany. Listen to this. Master Johann did position himself within 2 arms' lengths of Mistress Anna. Duration of proximity approximately 1/4 hour. Topics of conversation: the weather, her father's health, the price of grain. Concerning behaviours, Master Johann did smile overmuch when Mistress Anna spoke of her embroidery skills. Mistress Anna did lower her eyes in a manner that might be construed as coquettish. Recommendation: reduce future meeting duration to prevent development of unseemly attachment. These reports were submitted to both families and the church, and if the chaperones noted any concerning behaviour, the courtship could be immediately terminated. But the chaperone system was just the beginning. Medieval society had actual measurement requirements for how close unmarried people could stand to each other. The standard rule was 2 arms' lengths at minimum burn, but in many regions it was even more restrictive. I found legal documents from 13th century France that required unmarried couples to maintain the distance of a horse's length, meaning they had to stand far enough apart that a full-sized horse could walk between them. And these weren't just suggestions. There were actual enforcers whose job was to measure and monitor these distances. In larger towns, the church employed people called moral wardens, who would patrol public spaces with measuring sticks, ensuring that unmarried people weren't standing too close together. Let me tell you what happened to Thomas and Eleanor in 1289, because their story shows you just how brutally this system was enforced. Thomas was a young blacksmith courting Eleanor, the daughter of a local carpenter. They had proper parental approval, church permission, and always met with approved chaperones. They followed every rule perfectly for 6 months. But one autumn afternoon, during a chaperoned walk through the town market, Eleanor stumbled on an uneven cobblestone. Thomas instinctively reached out to steady her, and for maybe 3 seconds, he held her elbow to prevent her from falling. A moral warden witnessed this unauthorized physical contact and immediately reported it to the authorities. Both Thomas and Eleanor were arrested on charges of unseemly physical intimacy outside the bonds of holy marriage. Their punishment: Thomas was sentenced to 3 days in the public stocks, where townspeople pelted him with rotten vegetables and animal waste. Eleanor was confined to her home for 6 weeks and forced to perform public penance every Sunday, standing before the entire congregation while the priest detailed her moral failing But here's the most devastating part. The incident was considered so scandalous that Eleanor's reputation was permanently destroyed. Thomas's family withdrew their marriage offer. No other families would consider courting her, and she never married. She spent the rest of her life as a spinster, all because a man touched her elbow to prevent her from falling. And this wasn't an extreme punishment. This was standard enforcement of physical contact laws. The restrictions on written communication were even more insane. Love letters weren't just monitored. They were considered potential evidence of heretical thinking and sexual deviance. Every letter between unmarried people had to be pre-approved by church authorities. Both families had to submit draft letters to their local priest, who would review the content for anything that might be considered inappropriately passionate or spiritually dangerous. The approved vocabulary for romantic correspondence was incredibly limited. Men could write about their respect and admiration for a woman, but never their love or desire. Women could express gratitude for a man's attention, but any language suggesting emotional attachment was strictly forbidden. I discovered this fascinating collection of rejected love letters from a monastery in Italy. The priests would confiscate letters that violated content rules and keep them as examples of moral corruption. Listen to some of the phrases that were considered so dangerous they could get you arrested. I think of you often. Rejected for suggesting obsessive attachment. Your beauty brings me joy. Rejected for focusing on physical appearance. I eagerly await our next meeting. Rejected for expressing excessive enthusiasm. You're dear to me. Rejected for implying emotional intimacy. The safest approved phrase for expressing romantic interest was, I hold you in Christian regard as a potential partner in holy matrimony for the glory of God. Seriously, that was considered the maximum appropriate expression of romantic feeling. But even if you managed to write letters that passed church censorship, the delivery system was designed to eliminate any privacy whatsoever. Letters had to be delivered through official church messengers who were required to read every letter before delivery and report any concerning content to church authorities. And here's something that will shock you. The church kept permanent records of all romantic correspondence. They had entire libraries filled with copies of love letters, indexed by family name, that they would reference when making decisions about future marriage permissions. A poorly worded letter could affect not just your own romantic prospects, but those of your children and grandchildren. The surveillance network for monitoring unauthorized romance was incredibly sophisticated. Medieval communities had systems of informants and reporters that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. Church authorities actively recruited people to monitor and report romantic behavior. Servants were encouraged to spy on their employers' children. Neighbors were rewarded for reporting suspicious romantic activity. Even family members were incentivized to inform on each other. There were financial rewards for reporting violations. A servant who reported unauthorized physical contact between unmarried people could receive up to a month's wages as a reward. This created a culture where everyone was watching everyone else, where any moment of romantic spontaneity could be reported and punished. The psychological impact of living under this level of surveillance was devastating. Young people developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, constantly worried that any natural expression of attraction or affection might be witnessed and reported. But perhaps the most cruel aspect of this physical contact police state was how it affected women specifically. Because while men faced punishment for romantic violations, women faced complete social destruction. A woman who was caught in any kind of unauthorized physical contact, even something as innocent as walking too close to a man, was permanently marked as morally compromised. Her marriage prospects were destroyed, her family's reputation was damaged, and she was often forced into servitude or religious life. Medieval society had created a system where women were simultaneously required to be attractive enough to secure marriage proposals, but any sign that they were actually attracted to someone could destroy their lives forever. And if you think the restrictions on physical contact and written communication were extreme, just wait until you hear about the thought police. Because medieval society didn't just control what you could do and say, they believed they had the right to control what you could think and dream. And the punishment for having the wrong thoughts, the wrong dreams, the wrong feelings, was so brutal that it makes everything we've talked about so far look merciful. That thought police was the medieval church's most terrifying weapon, the belief that they could control not just your actions, but your very dreams and thoughts. and the punishment for having unauthorized romantic dreams was so brutal, so absolutely insane, that it defies belief. Dreaming about your crush could literally get you burned at the stake for witchcraft. Here's a statistic that will shock you to your core. Medieval church records document 156 formal witch trials that began with accusations of demonic romantic dreams. 156 people were put on trial for the crime of dreaming about someone they weren't married to. Let me explain exactly how this nightmare system worked, because the level of psychological control they attempted to exercise makes modern thought policing look like amateur hour. Medieval church doctrine taught that dreams were direct communications with the supernatural world. They believed that when you dreamed about someone romantically, you weren't just having a normal human experience, you were either receiving a message from God about your future marriage, or you were being tempted by demons trying to corrupt your soul. And guess which explanation they usually went with? Here's how the dream surveillance system actually worked. During mandatory weekly confession, priests were required to ask specific questions about the romantic content of your dreams, and these weren't gentle inquiries. These were intensive interrogations designed to root out any sign of unauthorized spiritual activity. I found this incredible manual from 1298 that trained priests on how to conduct dream interrogations. Listen to the actual questions they were instructed to ask. Have you experienced dreams of physical intimacy with any person? Have you dreamed of marriage to someone not approved by your family? Have you awakened from dreams, feeling desire or longing? Have you attempted to dream of specific individuals? Do you find yourself thinking of your dreams during waking hours? And here's the most terrifying part. If you answered yes to any of these questions, the priest was required to begin what they called a demonic influence investigation. Let me tell you the story of Maria Rossetti from 14th century Italy, because her experience shows you just how deadly these dream investigations could become. Maria was a 19-year-old merchant's daughter who had been having dreams about Lorenzo, a young man her family was considering as a potential husband. These weren't sexual dreams. She was dreaming about conversations with him, about walking through gardens together, about simple, innocent romantic scenarios. During her weekly confession, Maria honestly told her priest about these dreams. The priest immediately became suspicious because Maria's dreams were too vivid, too detailed, and too frequent to be natural. He reported Maria to the Inquisition as a possible case of demonic possession or witchcraft. The investigation that followed destroyed her life and her family. First, they brought in a team of dream specialists, church officials who were supposedly trained to identify supernatural influence in dreams. They subjected Maria to interrogation sessions that lasted up to 12 hours, demanding that she describe every detail of every dream she could remember. They were looking for specific signs of demonic influence dreams that occurred at unusual times, dreams with too much sensory detail, dreams where she could hear voices clearly, dreams where she felt strong emotions. According to their criteria, Maria's dreams checked every box for demonic activity. The next phase was even more brutal. They subjected Maria to what they called spiritual testing to determine if she was possessed or if she was actively practicing witchcraft. They forced her to fast for weeks until she was weak and hallucinating. They made her recite prayers continuously for hours until she collapsed from exhaustion. They subjected her to exorcism rituals that involved physical abuse disguised as spiritual cleansing. And through all of this, they kept detailed records of her responses, looking for any sign that she was resisting their efforts or showing continued demonic influence. The final verdict was that Maria was guilty of willful congress with demonic forces for the purpose of achieving unlawful romantic attachment. She was sentenced to death by burning. Her execution took place in the town square with the entire community forced to watch. The official church record states that her death was necessary to prevent the spread of demonic romantic corruption to other young women in the community. Maria died because she had dreams about a boy her family was already considering as a husband. Dreams that today we would recognize as completely normal teenage romantic fantasies. And Maria's case wasn't unusual. Medieval witch trial records are filled with cases that began with accusations of romantic dreams. The church maintained detailed categories of dangerous dreams that could trigger investigations. Dreams of physical contact were considered evidence of lustful demon influence. Dreams of marriage to specific individuals were considered attempts to manipulate divine will. Dreams that occurred repeatedly were considered evidence of ongoing demonic communication. Dreams that included specific sensory details were considered too vivid to be natural. But perhaps most terrifyingly, dreams where you felt happy or excited were considered the most dangerous of all, because they suggested you were enjoying the demonic influence rather than resisting it. The community surveillance around dreams was incredibly sophisticated. Family members were encouraged to report if relatives seemed happy after waking up, if they talked about dreams during the day, or if they seemed distracted or dreamy. Servants were trained to watch for signs that young people in the household might be having romantic dreams, sleeping too soundly, smiling while asleep, talking in their sleep, or seeming unusually cheerful in the morning. Even the timing of your sleep was monitored. Going to bed too early or too late could be considered evidence that you were trying to manipulate your dreams. Sleeping too deeply was suspicious because it suggested you weren't resisting demonic influence. The church actually published guidelines for spiritually safe sleep practices that were designed to prevent romantic dreams. These included sleeping in uncomfortable positions to prevent deep sleep, keeping religious icons visible while sleeping to ward off demons, reciting specific prayers before bed to request divine protection from romantic thoughts, eating certain foods that were believed to suppress dreams, avoiding certain activities during the day that might trigger romantic dreams at night. But the most insidious aspect of dream control was how it affected people's mental health. Imagine being afraid to fall asleep because you might have the wrong dream. Imagine waking up terrified every morning, trying to remember if you dreamed anything that could get you killed. Many people developed what we would now recognize as severe insomnia and anxiety disorders. They were literally afraid to let their minds relax because they couldn't control their subconscious thoughts. I found this heartbreaking diary entry from a young woman in 15th century Germany. "I have not slept properly in 3 months. Every time I close my eyes, I fear what visions might come. I pray constantly for dreamless sleep, but even dreamless sleep is considered suspicious. I am trapped between demons in my dreams and inquisitors in my waking hours. I no longer know which is worse." The psychological torture of dream monitoring was compounded by the fact that romantic attraction itself was considered a form of mental illness that required medical intervention. But if you think dream policing was the most extreme form of thought control, you haven't heard anything yet, because medieval society went one step further and declared that sexual attraction itself, even conscious, waking attraction to another person, was a mortal sin that required public confession and brutal physical punishment to cure. That sexual attraction was literally classified as a mortal sin requiring immediate public confession and brutal physical punishment. And when I say brutal, I mean they believed that feeling attracted to someone was so dangerous to your immortal soul that it required the same level of intervention as murder or blasphemy. Having hormones was literally a crime against God that required public humiliation to cure. Here's something that will absolutely destroy your mind. Medieval church doctrine taught that sexual attraction, even between people who were already approved for marriage, was evidence of demonic possession that needed to be beaten out of your body through public penance. Let me show you exactly how this insane system worked, because the level of shame and psychological torture they inflicted on people for having normal human feelings is so extreme that it makes modern purity culture look like sex-positive feminism. The church required what they called attraction confessions during weekly mandatory confession. But these weren't private conversations between you and a priest. These were public announcements of your spiritual failure that the entire community was required to witness. Here's how the process worked. If you confess to feeling attraction to someone, and remember, lying during confession was considered perjury against God, you were immediately assigned a public penance that was specifically designed to humiliate you in front of everyone you knew. I found this incredible document from 1311 that details the standard penance requirements for different types of attraction confessions. Listen to how insane this was. For confessing to lustful thoughts about someone, you were required to stand naked from the waist up in the town square for 3 consecutive Sundays while the priest read your sins aloud to the gathering crowd. For confessing to physical desire for your approved fiancé, you were required to wear a sign around your neck stating, "I have sinned through lustful thoughts," and wear it for 2 weeks while going about your daily business. For confessing to attraction to someone not approved for marriage, You were subjected to public flogging with a leather whip, while the crowd was encouraged to throw rotten food and animal waste at you. But here's the most psychologically devastating part. The church taught that feeling attraction meant you were spiritually weak and morally compromised. Even attraction within approved relationships was considered evidence that you loved earthly pleasures more than God. Let me tell you the story of Catherine and William from 13th century England, because their experience shows you just how destructive this system was even for couples doing everything right. Catherine and William were engaged with full parental and church approval. They had followed every rule perfectly: proper chaperoning, approved correspondence, appropriate financial arrangements. Their wedding was scheduled for the following spring, but during one of their supervised meetings, Catherine felt what she later described as a warming of the heart when William smiled at her. That night, troubled by this feeling, she confessed to her priest that she had experienced inappropriate affection for her fiancé. The priest immediately declared this a serious spiritual crisis that required intervention. Catherine was assigned public penance that included standing before the entire congregation for 4 consecutive Sundays while the priest detailed her lustful thoughts about William, fasting for 6 weeks on bread and water to purify her spirit of carnal desire, performing manual labour for the church, scrubbing floors, washing altar cloths, cleaning chamber pots, while wearing a sign identifying her as a penitent sinner against holy chastity. But the most devastating punishment was psychological. The priest declared that Catherine's attraction to William proved she was entering marriage for the wrong reasons, and he recommended that the engagement be dissolved to protect both of their souls. William's family, horrified by the scandal and convinced that Catherine was spiritually compromised, withdrew their marriage offer. Catherine, now marked as a woman who had confessed to lustful thoughts, found that no other families would consider her for their sons. She spent the rest of her life as a spinster, all because she felt happy when her approved fiancé smiled at her. And this wasn't an extreme case. This was the standard application of church doctrine regarding sexual attraction. The church maintained detailed categories of attraction that required different levels of punishment. Sinful thoughts about someone's appearance required public confession and minor penance. Lustful desires for physical contact required public humiliation and fasting. Carnal longings for sexual intimacy required public flogging and extended penance. Obsessive attraction that interfered with prayer required investigation for possible demonic possession. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this system was how it created what can only be described as attraction surveillance networks within communities. Family members were encouraged to monitor each other for signs of attraction. Parents were taught to watch their children for symptoms like excessive attention to appearance when certain people would be present, distraction during prayers or work, changes in appetite or sleep patterns, or any sign of happiness that coincided with romantic opportunities. Servants were trained to report if young people in wealthy households showed signs of attraction. They were taught to watch for lingering looks during chaperoned meetings, changes in behaviour before or after seeing approved suitors, private conversations about romance, or any indication that the young person was looking forward to romantic encounters. Even friends were encouraged to report each other's attraction. The church taught that allowing someone to continue in lustful thoughts without reporting them was enabling their spiritual destruction. I discovered this absolutely horrifying document from a convent in France, a manual that trained nuns to identify signs of dangerous attraction in the young women sent to them for religious education. It includes detailed instructions on how to monitor sleep talking that might reveal romantic thoughts, changes in prayer intensity that might indicate distraction by earthly desires, physical symptoms like blushing or rapid heartbeat when certain topics were mentioned, and even changes in handwriting that might suggest emotional instability caused by attraction. The psychological impact of living under this level of surveillance was catastrophic. Young people learned to suppress not just their actions and words, but their very feelings. They developed what we would now recognize as severe emotional disorders from trying to eliminate natural human attraction. Mental health records from medieval monasteries show epidemic levels of what they called spiritual depression, what we would now recognize as clinical depression caused by shame and emotional suppression. Suicide rates among young people were significantly higher in regions with particularly strict attraction monitoring, but the church didn't see this psychological damage as a problem. They saw it as proof that their system was working. They believed that making people miserable about their natural feelings was actually saving their souls from eternal damnation. The economic impact of attraction confessions was also devastating for families. Public penance often meant that young people couldn't work for weeks or months while they fulfilled their punishment requirements. The shame associated with attraction confessions could destroy business relationships and social connections that families depended on for survival. And here's something that will shock you. The church actually profited from attraction confessions. Each public penance came with required financial donations to the church. The more serious your attraction confession, the more money you had to pay for your spiritual rehabilitation. A typical middle-class family might spend the equivalent of 2 months' income on church fees related to their child's attraction confession. Wealthy families were often charged amounts that could bankrupt them. This made every natural human feeling a potential economic disaster for your entire family. But if you think the punishment for attraction within your own social class and religion was extreme, you haven't seen anything yet, because medieval society reserved its most brutal, most deadly punishments for people who dared to feel attraction across religious boundaries. And when I say deadly, I mean that interfaith attraction wasn't just a sin against God. It was considered an act of war against Christian civilization that could result in the execution of your entire family. That interfaith attraction was considered such a grave threat to Christian civilization that it carried the death penalty not just for the couple involved, but for their entire families. And when I say entire families, I mean grandparents, siblings, cousins, even distant relatives could be executed for the crime of one family member falling in love with someone of a different faith. Romeo and Juliet had it easy. Interfaith couples faced family extinction. Here's a statistic that will absolutely shatter your understanding of medieval justice, church, and civil records from the 13th and 14th centuries document over 300 cases where entire extended families, sometimes 20 or more people, were executed because one family member was discovered in a romantic relationship with someone of a different religion. Let me show you exactly how this system of religious romantic apartheid worked, because the level of systematic brutality they employed to prevent interfaith love makes ethnic cleansing look restrained. The legal framework was crystal clear. Any romantic contact between a Christian and a non-Christian was classified as the same level of crime as treason against God and King. It wasn't just forbidden, it was considered an act of war against the fundamental order of society. But the punishment structure was designed to be so terrifying that even thinking about interfaith romance would seem impossible. They didn't just punish the couple, they created a system of collective punishment that made every family member a prison guard for every other family member. Let me tell you the story of David Ben Abraham and Marie de Montpellier from 1278, because their case shows you just how absolutely devastating this system could be. David was a Jewish merchant living in the Jewish quarter of a French city. Marie was a Christian baker's daughter whose family lived just outside the Jewish quarter. For months, they had been seeing each other in secret during market days, just talking at first, then gradually falling in love. Their romance was discovered by a neighbour who reported it to church authorities. Within 24 hours, both families were arrested. But here's where the medieval justice system showed its true brutality. The authorities didn't just arrest David and Marie. They arrested David's parents, his 2 brothers, his sister, his uncle, and his grandfather. On Marie's side, they arrested her parents, her 3 siblings, 2 aunts, and her grandmother. 17 people were imprisoned because 2 young people fell in love. The charges were staggering. David was charged with corruption of Christian virtue and assault against the sacred order. Marie was charged with betrayal of Christ and willing submission to Jewish defilement. But the family members were charged with conspiracy to destroy Christian purity, simply because they had failed to prevent the relationship. The trial lasted 3 months and involved testimony from over 100 community members. The prosecution argued that interfaith romance was a deliberate attack on Christian civilization that required the most severe possible response to prevent its spread. The verdict was death for everyone involved. David was sentenced to be burned alive while Marie was forced to watch. Marie was then to be hanged immediately after David's death. But the family punishments were even more elaborate and cruel. David's father was to be drawn and quartered, his mother was to be burned at the stake, his brothers were to be hanged, his sister, because she was unmarried, was to be sold into slavery. The elderly grandfather was to be stoned to death. Marie's family faced similar sentences. Her father was to be beheaded. Her mother was to be burned alive. Her siblings were to be hanged. Her aunts were to be flogged to death. The executions took place over 3 days in the town square, with the entire community forced to watch as a warning about the consequences of interfaith love. 17 people died because 2 young people from different religions fell in love. And this wasn't an isolated incident. This was standard enforcement of interfaith romance laws across medieval Europe. The Inquisition maintained specialized courts specifically for interfaith romance cases. These courts had broader authority than regular criminal courts, and could investigate anyone suspected of interfaith romantic activity without requiring evidence or accusations. The investigation process was incredibly invasive. Inquisition agents would interview every member of both families, every servant in both households, every neighbour who might have witnessed suspicious behaviour, and every merchant or craftsman who had business dealings with either family. They would examine financial records to look for suspicious transactions that might indicate secret meetings or gift exchanges. They would search homes for any evidence of interfaith contact, letters, gifts, or any items that might suggest romantic attachment across religious lines. But perhaps most terrifyingly, they used torture to extract confessions not just from the accused couple, but from family members who might have knowledge of the relationship. I found this detailed record from an Inquisition court in Spain that shows the torture methods specifically used for interfaith romance investigations. Family members were subjected to motivational torture designed to make them reveal any knowledge of interfaith romantic activity. This included thumbscrews, rack stretching, and water torture applied until the person either confessed to knowledge of the relationship or convinced the torturers they genuinely knew nothing. Even children were tortured if investigators suspected they might have witnessed interfaith romantic contact. There are records of children as young as 10 being subjected to gentle torture, a horrific euphemism for torture methods that wouldn't cause permanent physical damage but would cause maximum psychological trauma. The forced conversion process for couples who tried to avoid execution by changing religion was equally brutal. The non-Christian partner would be subjected to forced baptism that included public renunciation of their previous faith, while being whipped by religious authorities. Destruction of all religious items, books, or cultural artifacts from their previous life. Mandatory public confession of their previous spiritual crimes against Christianity. Assignment to a Christian family who would monitor their religious compliance for the rest of their life. But even forced conversion often didn't save couples from execution. Church authorities argued that love between people of different original faiths was evidence of spiritual corruption that couldn't be cleansed through conversion. The psychological warfare against interfaith attraction was incredibly sophisticated. Communities were required to hold annual purity celebrations, where successful prevention of interfaith romance was celebrated, and cases of interfaith relationships were publicly condemned. Children were taught from early childhood to identify and report any signs of interfaith romantic activity. They were trained to watch for family members who showed interest in people from other religious communities, conversations that suggested knowledge of other religious practices, any indication that someone might be curious about other faiths, or signs that someone might be questioning the superiority of Christianity. The economic incentives for reporting interfaith romance were substantial. People who reported interfaith romantic activity received financial rewards, tax reductions, and social status improvements. This created communities where everyone was financially motivated to spy on everyone else. But the most insidious aspect of this system was how it affected the children of families that had been punished for interfaith romance. These children were marked for life as coming from religiously compromised bloodlines. They faced restrictions on where they could live, often confined to specific areas of towns where they could work, banned from many professions who they could marry. Other families wouldn't accept them as marriage partners, what religious activities they could participate in, excluded from many church functions. The generational impact of interfaith romance punishment lasted for decades. Families could be destroyed for generations because of one romantic relationship that crossed religious lines. But if you think religious barriers to love were the most extreme form of social control, you're about to discover that medieval society had created an even more rigid and deadly system based on social class. a system where falling in love with someone from a different economic level wasn't just forbidden, it was considered a form of treason that threatened the very foundations of civilization itself. That social class system was so rigid, so absolutely unforgiving, that falling in love across class lines was literally considered the same crime as treason against the king. And the punishment for cross-class romance wasn't just exile or imprisonment, it was automatic execution, not just for the couple, but for anyone who helped or enabled their relationship. Dating outside your social class was literally considered treason against God and king. Here's a statistic that will blow your mind. Medieval legal records show that cross-class romantic relationships carried the exact same death penalty as plotting to assassinate royalty. The same crime, the same punishment. Because medieval society believed that social class mixing was just as dangerous to civilization as political rebellion. Let me show you exactly how this insane system worked. Because the level of class-based apartheid they enforced makes modern inequality look like gentle suggestions about social preferences. Medieval society had legally defined class boundaries that were as rigid and enforced as national borders. These weren't just social customs or traditions. These were actual laws with specific legal definitions, enforcement mechanisms, and brutal punishment systems. The class system was divided into exact legal categories: nobility lords, knights and their families, clergy priests, monks and church officials, merchants traders, craftsmen and their families, peasants, farmers, labourers and servants, and the unclassed beggars, criminals and outcasts. Each class had specific legal rights and restrictions that were written into law. And one of the most strictly enforced restrictions was romantic contact across class lines. Let me tell you the story of Sir Edmund de Grey and Anna the Miller's daughter from 1345, because their case shows you just how absolutely deadly class mixing could be. Sir Edmund was a minor nobleman, not wealthy, but technically part of the aristocracy. Anna was the daughter of a miller, which placed her in the merchant class. In modern terms, this would be like a middle manager dating someone from a working-class family. Not a huge social gap by today's standards, but in medieval terms, this was crossing a legal boundary that was considered as serious as crossing enemy lines during wartime. Their relationship began innocently enough. Edmund's horse had thrown a shoe near Anna's father's mill, and while waiting for repairs, he struck up a conversation with Anna. They discovered they both loved reading, unusual for people of any class, but especially for a miller's daughter. Over several months, Edmund found excuses to visit the mill. They would talk about books, about ideas, about their dreams for the future. It was an intellectual connection that grew into genuine love, but their relationship was discovered by one of Edmund's servants, who reported it to Edmund's family as required by law. The legal process that followed destroyed both of their lives and the lives of everyone connected to them. Edmund was immediately arrested by royal authorities on charges of degradation of noble blood and conspiracy against the natural order. But the charges didn't stop there. Anna was arrested on charges of seduction of nobility and assault against the sacred hierarchy. Her father was charged with facilitating class corruption for allowing the meetings to take place. Her mother and two younger brothers were charged with conspiracy to destroy social order for not reporting Anna's relationship. But here's where the medieval justice system showed its true brutality. They also arrested the servant who had repaired Edmund's horse, the priest who had seen them talking after church, and even Anna's elderly grandmother who lived in the same house. 9 people were facing execution because 2 people from different social classes fell in love. The trial was a showcase of medieval class obsession. The prosecution argued that cross-class romance was a direct attack on the divine order that God had established for society. They claimed that allowing nobles and commoners to intermarry would lead to the complete collapse of civilization. Expert witnesses included church officials who testified that class mixing was against God's will. Legal scholars who argued that social mobility through marriage was a form of theft. And even physicians who claimed that children from cross-class relationships would be physically and mentally defective. The defense tried to argue that Edmund and Anna's relationship was pure and intellectual, that they had never even touched hands, that their connection was based on shared interests rather than physical attraction. It didn't matter. The court ruled that the very act of a noble person forming emotional attachment to a commoner was evidence of mental instability that threatened the stability of the entire social system. The sentences were swift and brutal. Edmund was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor to his class. Anna was to be burned alive as a seductress who had corrupted noble blood. Her father was to be beheaded for failing to protect the social order. Her mother and brothers were to be hanged as conspirators. The executions took place in front of the largest crowd in the region's history. The authorities wanted everyone to see what happened to people who dared to love across class lines. But perhaps the most chilling part of this story is what happened to Anna's grandmother, who was 78 years old and had never even spoken to Edmund. She was sentenced to be stoned to death by the community because she had failed in her duty to monitor and control her granddaughter's dangerous social ambitions. 9 people died because a nobleman and a miller's daughter discovered they both enjoyed reading. And this wasn't an extreme case. This was standard enforcement of class-based romantic laws across medieval Europe. The legal framework supporting class separation was incredibly sophisticated. Every region had detailed laws specifying exactly which classes could intermarry and which combinations were forbidden. These laws were enforced by specialized courts called social purity tribunals that had the authority to investigate any suspected cross-class romantic activity. These tribunals employed networks of informants, conducted surveillance operations, and had the power to arrest entire families based on suspicion alone. The clothing laws that enforced class boundaries were particularly relevant to romantic control. Each social class was required by law to wear specific types of clothing, jewellery, and accessories that made their class status immediately visible. This meant that any romantic interaction between people of different classes was immediately obvious to observers. A nobleman talking to a peasant woman would be instantly recognizable as a potential class violation that needed to be reported. But the clothing laws went even further than identification. They were designed to make cross-class attraction psychologically difficult. Lower-class people were required to wear drab, shapeless clothing that concealed their physical attractiveness. They were forbidden from wearing bright colours, fitted garments, or any decoration that might make them appealing to higher-class individuals. The economic motivations behind class separation laws were incredibly sophisticated. Medieval society had created an economic system where social mobility through marriage was seen as a form of theft that threatened the wealth and power of established families. Noble families controlled land. Peasant families provided labour. Merchant families controlled trade. If these groups intermarried, it would redistribute wealth and power in ways that threatened the entire economic structure. Cross-class marriage was literally seen as economic warfare against the established order. The Church provided religious justification for class separation by teaching that social class was divinely ordained. They argued that God had created different classes of people for different purposes, and attempting to change your social class through marriage was a form of rebellion against God's plan. Sermons regularly included warnings about the spiritual dangers of cross-class attraction. Priests taught that feeling attracted to someone from a different class was evidence of pride, greed, or other mortal sins that required immediate confession and penance. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of the class separation system was how it affected people's self-worth and identity. Lower-class people were taught from childhood that they were inherently inferior and that aspiring to relationships with higher-class people was not just illegal, but morally wrong. Higher-class people were taught that they had a sacred duty to maintain their class purity, and that any attraction to lower-class people was a sign of moral weakness that brought shame to their entire family lineage. This created a society where people were literally afraid to feel attracted to anyone outside their narrow social stratum. Love became not just a personal emotion, but a political act that could result in death. The regional variations in class separation enforcement created bizarre medieval social dynamics. Areas with strict enforcement became known as romantic wastelands, where almost no marriages occurred because people were too afraid of accidentally crossing class lines. More lenient regions experienced what authorities called class contamination, waves of cross-class marriages that prompted crackdowns and mass executions to restore proper social order. But if you think the legal class boundaries were the most restrictive aspect of medieval romantic control, you haven't seen anything yet, because medieval society took social stratification one step further and created a system where your profession, not just your family's wealth or status, but your specific job, determined not just who you could marry, but whether you could marry at all. That professional system was so restrictive that your job didn't just influence your dating pool, it legally determined who you were allowed to fall in love with, and violating professional marriage laws could result in losing your livelihood, your home, and in some cases, your life. Medieval LinkedIn was your only dating app, and it had very strict compatibility rules. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. Medieval guild laws prohibited interprofessional marriage so strictly that blacksmiths were legally forbidden from marrying bakers. Carpenters couldn't marry weavers, and merchants couldn't marry farmers. These weren't social preferences. These were actual laws with real enforcement and brutal punishments. Let me show you exactly how this insane system worked, because the level of professional segregation they enforced makes modern career-based dating preferences look completely open-minded. Every profession in medieval society was controlled by organizations called guilds. These guilds didn't just regulate how you did your job, they controlled every aspect of your life, including who you were allowed to marry. The guild system was based on the theory that professional knowledge was so valuable and so dangerous that it had to be protected from contamination by other professions. They believed that allowing different professions to intermarry would lead to trade secrets being shared, economic competition being disrupted, and the entire professional hierarchy being destroyed. So they created marriage laws that were as rigid and enforced as military codes. Let me tell you the story of Thomas the blacksmith and Margaret the baker from 1387, because their case shows you just how destructive professional marriage laws could be. Thomas was a master blacksmith in a prosperous English town. He was skilled, successful, and well respected in his profession. Margaret was the daughter of the town's most successful baker. Her family's bread was famous throughout the region, and they were wealthy enough to own their own mill. In modern terms, this would be like a successful contractor falling in love with the daughter of a successful restaurant owner. Both skilled professionals, both from prosperous families, both contributing valuable services to their community. But in medieval terms, this was crossing a professional boundary that was considered economically dangerous and legally forbidden. Here's why the Blacksmiths Guild and the Bakers Guild had overlapping economic interests that created potential conflicts. Blacksmiths made the ovens, tools, and metal equipment that bakers used. Bakers provided food for blacksmith families and workers. If blacksmiths and bakers intermarried, the guilds argued, it would create unfair economic advantages. A blacksmith married to a baker's daughter might give her family better prices on equipment. A baker with a blacksmith husband might get priority service that other bakers couldn't access. This was considered a form of economic corruption that threatened the fairness of the entire professional system. When Thomas and Margaret's relationship was discovered, both guilds immediately launched investigations. The Blacksmiths Guild accused Thomas of professional betrayal and conspiracy to corrupt trade practices. The Bakers Guild accused Margaret's family of seduction for economic advantage and conspiracy to gain unfair professional benefits. The guild trial that followed was incredibly detailed and sophisticated. Both guilds brought in expert witnesses who testified about the economic dangers of professional intermarriage. The Blacksmiths Guild argued that if Thomas married Margaret, he would have access to insider information about baking techniques, grain suppliers, and pricing strategies that would give him unfair advantages in negotiations with other bakers. The Bakers Guild argued that Margaret's family would gain preferential access to blacksmith services, better prices on equipment, and inside knowledge of metalworking techniques that would give them competitive advantages over other baking families. Economic experts testified that professional intermarriage created what they called trade contamination, that would eventually destroy the guild system and lead to economic chaos. The verdict was swift and devastating. Thomas was expelled from the Blacksmiths Guild, which meant he could never work as a blacksmith again anywhere in England. Margaret's family was fined so heavily that they lost their bakery and were forced to leave town. Thomas and Margaret were forbidden from marrying each other and from marrying anyone from each other's professions for the rest of their lives. Thomas ended up working as a common labourer, using none of his professional skills. Margaret never married because her association with the blacksmith scandal made her unmarriageable within the baker community. Two successful professionals had their lives destroyed because their guilds considered their love economically dangerous. And this wasn't an unusual case. This was standard enforcement of professional marriage laws across medieval Europe. The guild system had created incredibly detailed professional hierarchies that determined marriage compatibility. There were professions that were considered complementary and could intermarry, professions that were competitive and were forbidden to intermarry, and professions that were contaminating and couldn't marry anyone outside their own trade. For example, carpenters and masons were considered complementary because they worked on different aspects of the same buildings, but carpenters and furniture makers were considered competitive because they both worked with wood, and intermarriage between them was forbidden. Physicians and apothecaries couldn't intermarry because they were considered competing medical professions, but physicians and nobles could intermarry because medicine and aristocracy were considered complementary rather than competitive. The apprenticeship system made professional romantic control even more invasive. Young people who were training in trades were essentially owned by their master craftsmen, who had complete control over their romantic lives. Apprentices couldn't marry anyone without their master's permission. Masters could forbid apprentices from courting anyone they considered professionally inappropriate, and masters could cancel apprenticeships if they discovered unauthorized romantic relationships. I found this incredible contract from 1298 between a young man and a carpenter who was training him. Listen to this clause: "The apprentice shall not engage in romantic discourse with any person employed in competing trades, shall not court any woman whose family is engaged in woodworking professions other than carpentry, and shall submit all romantic intentions to the master for approval before engaging in any courtship activities." This meant that young people had to get permission from their professional trainers before they could even think about dating someone. The economic reasoning behind professional marriage restrictions was incredibly sophisticated. Guild leaders had calculated that professional intermarriage could lead to trade secret sharing that would eliminate competitive advantages, price coordination that would disrupt fair market competition, resource sharing that would give some families unfair business benefits, skill contamination that would blur professional boundaries, economic alliances that would threaten guild independence. They had essentially created an economic theory that treated love as a form of insider trading that needed to be regulated and controlled. The enforcement mechanisms were incredibly effective. Guild networks covered all of Europe, and information about professional marriage violations was shared between cities and regions. If you were expelled from a guild in one area for a marriage violation, you could never work in that profession anywhere. This created a system where your romantic choices could destroy not just your love life, but your entire economic future. The psychological impact of professional marriage restrictions was devastating for young people, trying to figure out their careers and their romantic lives simultaneously. They had to choose their profession, knowing that it would determine their entire dating pool for the rest of their lives. Many young people delayed choosing professions because they were afraid of limiting their romantic options. Others chose professions based on the marriage opportunities they provided rather than their interests or abilities. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the professional marriage system was how it created genetic isolation within professional communities. Because people could only marry within their trade groups, they were essentially creating closed breeding populations. This led to increased rates of genetic diseases, physical abnormalities, and mental health problems within specific professional communities. Blacksmith families developed disproportionate rates of certain hereditary conditions. Baker families had characteristic physical traits that came from generations of intermarriage. The guild system had created professional inbreeding that was literally damaging the health of entire occupational groups. But if you think professional restrictions were the most extreme form of genetic control that medieval society employed, you're about to discover something that will shock you to your core. Because medieval society took genetic purity so seriously that they required 7 generations of family history investigation before approving any marriage. And if they found any impurity in your bloodline, any evidence that your ancestors had violated social, religious, or professional boundaries, it could disqualify you from love permanently. That bloodline investigation was so thorough, so absolutely comprehensive, that it made FBI background checks look like casual small talk. Medieval society required 7 full generations of pure family history before they would approve any noble marriage. And when I say pure, I mean they were looking for any evidence of social mixing, religious deviation, or professional contamination going back over 200 years. Medieval background checks made FBI investigations look like casual small talk. Here's something that will absolutely destroy your understanding of medieval bureaucracy. For noble marriages, church and civil authorities would conduct genealogical investigations that required documentation of every single ancestor, their marriages, their professions, their religious activities, and their legal standing going back 7 complete generations. That's potentially over 250 individual people whose lives had to be investigated and approved. Let me show you exactly how this insane system worked, because the level of genealogical surveillance they conducted makes modern DNA testing look like recreational hobby activity. The 7-generation rule was based on medieval theories about bloodline contamination. Church scholars had calculated that it took exactly 7 generations for impure blood to be completely cleansed from a family line. Any contamination, social, religious, or professional, that occurred within 7 generations was considered still active and dangerous. So before any noble marriage could be approved, investigators had to prove that both family lines were completely pure for 200 plus years. The investigation process was incredibly sophisticated and invasive. Teams of professional genealogists, church historians, and legal researchers would spend months or even years documenting every detail of both families' histories. Let me tell you the story of Lady Eleanor de Montfort and Lord Richard de Clare from 1323 because their case shows you just how devastating these bloodline investigations could be. Eleanor and Richard were both from ancient noble families. Their parents had negotiated their engagement when they were children. Church authorities had given preliminary approval, and the financial arrangements were already in place. By every visible standard, this was a perfect noble marriage alliance. But when the formal 7-generation investigation began, the researchers discovered what they called contamination events in both family lines. In Eleanor's family tree, they found that her great-great-grandmother had briefly been married to a merchant before marrying into nobility. Even though this marriage had lasted less than a year and had been annulled by the church, it was considered evidence of commercial contamination that had tainted Eleanor's bloodline. In Richard's family tree, they discovered that his great-great-great-grandfather had once been accused of heresy, charges that were dropped and never proven. But the mere accusation was considered evidence of spiritual contamination that made Richard's bloodline suspect. The investigation report was over 300 pages long and included detailed analysis of every marriage, every profession, every legal proceeding, and every church record for both families over 7 generations. The conclusion was devastating. Both families were considered genealogically compromised, and the marriage was forbidden. Eleanor and Richard, who had been engaged for over a decade and had built their entire lives around their planned marriage, were suddenly informed that their bloodlines were too impure for them to marry each other or anyone else of comparable noble status. Eleanor was eventually married to a minor baron whose family was so desperate for a marriage alliance that they were willing to accept her contaminated bloodline. Richard never married at all because no noble family would accept his genealogical status, and this wasn't an extreme case. This was standard enforcement of bloodline purity laws across medieval Europe. The documentation requirements for these investigations were absolutely staggering. Investigators needed original marriage certificates for every union in 7 generations, baptismal records proving religious orthodoxy for every ancestor, professional guild records documenting occupational purity, court records showing legal standing and any criminal accusations, church records showing religious participation and donations, property records documenting wealth and social status, witness testimonies from community members about family reputation. For a typical noble family, this meant gathering potentially thousands of individual documents spread across multiple countries and spanning over 200 years. The cost of these investigations was astronomical. Families would spend the equivalent of entire estates just on the research fees, travel expenses, and documentation costs required for bloodline verification. But here's where the system became even more insidious. Because these investigations were so expensive and time-consuming, an entire industry developed around genealogical fabrication. Professional forgers would create fake family histories for wealthy families who couldn't meet the purity requirements. They would forge marriage certificates, baptismal records, and legal documents to create completely fictional genealogies that would pass investigation. Some families would pay fortunes to have their actual family histories erased and replaced with fabricated bloodlines that met medieval purity standards. I discovered this incredible collection of documents from a monastery in France that served as a centre for genealogical forgery. They had workshops where monks would create fake medieval documents using authentic materials and historical writing techniques. Their price list shows just how valuable pure bloodlines were. Creating a false noble lineage for one generation cost the equivalent of a year's income for a wealthy merchant family. Creating a completely fabricated 7-generation noble bloodline cost the equivalent of a small kingdom's annual tax revenue. But even families wealthy enough to afford fake genealogies faced constant danger of discovery. Rival families would hire investigators to verify each other's bloodline claims, looking for evidence of genealogical fraud. If fabrication was discovered, the punishment was catastrophic. The family would lose all noble status, all property would be confiscated, and they could be exiled or executed for fraud against the social order. The psychological pressure of bloodline investigations was devastating for young nobles who lived in constant fear that some unknown ancestor might have compromised their marriage prospects. Many noble families kept detailed genealogical records specifically to monitor for any potential bloodline problems. They would track every marriage, every profession, every legal issue, and every religious activity of all family members to ensure that future generations wouldn't be disqualified from marriage. This created a form of genetic surveillance where families were constantly policing each other's behaviour to protect their bloodline purity. The regional variations in bloodline requirements created bizarre medieval genetic politics. Some areas had stricter purity standards than others, leading to migration patterns where families would relocate to regions with more lenient genealogical requirements. France had some of the strictest bloodline laws in Europe. England was more lenient but required more documentation. Germanic regions focused more on professional purity than social purity. This created a medieval genetic marketplace where families would shop for the most favourable bloodline requirements before arranging marriages. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the 7-generation system was its long-term genetic consequences. By requiring such strict bloodline purity, medieval society was essentially creating closed breeding populations within the noble class. This led to dramatically increased rates of genetic diseases, physical abnormalities, and mental health problems among medieval nobility. The very bloodline purity they were trying to protect was actually damaging the genetic health of their families. Medical records from medieval monasteries show that noble families had much higher rates of what we would now recognize as hereditary genetic disorders. The haemophilia that plagued European royal families for centuries was a direct result of the closed bloodline system. But if you think genealogical investigations were the most extreme form of control that medieval society exercised over love and marriage, you haven't seen anything yet. Because when all other forms of control failed, when couples somehow managed to navigate through parental approval, church permission, financial requirements, physical restrictions, religious compatibility, social class barriers, professional limitations, and bloodline purity standards, medieval society had one final, absolutely brutal method for resolving romantic disputes, a method that guaranteed someone would die, and that treated love as a matter that could only be settled through literal combat to the death. That final method was trial by combat, and when I say medieval society settled romantic disputes with actual sword fights to the death, I mean they had established legal frameworks that required men to literally kill each other over dating disagreements. Someone always died, and that was considered the most fair and just way to resolve matters of the heart. Tinder disputes were settled with actual swords, and someone always died. Here's something that will absolutely shatter your understanding of medieval justice. Trial by combat was not just allowed for romantic disputes, it was legally required. If two men claimed the same woman, if families disagreed about marriage arrangements, if there were accusations of romantic misconduct, the law demanded that the dispute be settled through mortal combat. Let me show you exactly how this insane system worked, because the level of legalized murder they employed to settle dating drama makes modern relationship conflicts look like peaceful meditation sessions. The legal framework for romantic combat was incredibly detailed and sophisticated. Medieval courts had specific rules governing when combat was required, how it should be conducted, what weapons were allowed, and what happened to the survivors and the families of the dead. Romantic trial by combat could be triggered by several situations. Two men claiming exclusive courtship rights to the same woman, disputes over dowry amounts or marriage contract terms, accusations of adultery or inappropriate romantic behaviour, conflicts over inheritance rights that affected marriage eligibility, or disagreements between families about approved marriage alliances. Once combat was declared, both parties were legally required to participate. Refusal to fight was considered an admission of guilt and resulted in automatic loss of all romantic claims, plus social exile and loss of property. Let me tell you the story of Sir Geoffrey de Ashby and Sir William de Thornton from 1356, because their case shows you just how absolutely brutal this system could be. Both men were courting Lady Isabella de Montclair, the daughter of a wealthy baron. Isabella's father had given preliminary approval to both suitors and was taking time to decide between them based on their respective dowry offers and family connections. But Sir Geoffrey became impatient and publicly claimed that he had exclusive courtship rights because he had spoken to Isabella first. Sir William disputed this claim, arguing that his family's superior bloodline gave him priority regardless of timing. When they couldn't resolve the dispute through negotiation, Isabella's father was legally required to call for trial by combat. The court ruled that both men would fight to the death, and the survivor would have exclusive rights to court Isabella. The combat rules were elaborate and specific. The fight would take place in a marked arena measuring exactly 60 feet by 40 feet. Both men could use any weapons they chose, but they had to be of equal value and quality. The fight would continue until one man was dead or completely unable to continue fighting. No mercy could be shown. Attempts to spare a defeated opponent were considered contempt of court. The preparation period lasted 1 month, during which both men were required to settle their affairs, make their final confessions, and prepare for possible death. The combat itself took place in front of the largest crowd the region had ever seen. Isabella was required by law to watch the entire fight, because she needed to understand the sacrifice being made for her romantic affections. The fight lasted nearly 3 hours. Both men were skilled warriors, equally matched in strength and training. Sir Geoffrey eventually gained the advantage and mortally wounded Sir William with a sword thrust through the chest. But here's the most horrifying part: Sir William didn't die immediately. He lay bleeding in the arena for over an hour while Sir Geoffrey stood guard over him, legally required to ensure he was completely dead before claiming victory. Isabella was forced to watch Sir William die slowly while the crowd cheered Sir Geoffrey's victory. When Sir William finally died, Sir Geoffrey was declared the winner and granted exclusive courtship rights to Isabella. But the trauma of watching a man die for her romantic attention had psychologically destroyed her. She refused to marry Sir Geoffrey and entered a convent instead. Sir Geoffrey had killed a man and gained nothing. Sir William was dead. Isabella's life was ruined. And this was considered a successful resolution of a romantic dispute by medieval legal standards. And this wasn't an unusual case. This was standard procedure for romantic conflicts across medieval Europe. The champion system made trial by combat even more brutal and widespread. If the men involved in romantic disputes weren't skilled fighters themselves, they could hire professional champions to fight on their behalf. This created a medieval industry of professional romantic warriors, men who made their living fighting to the death over other people's dating problems. I found these incredible financial records from a champion fighter in 14th century France who specialized in romantic combat. In just 1 year, he fought 12 different romantic disputes, killing 8 opponents and being wounded in every single fight. His fee structure shows just how common romantic combat had become standard romantic dispute: 50 silver pieces plus expenses. High-value inheritance romantic dispute, 100 silver pieces plus expenses. Noble family romantic dispute, 200 silver pieces plus expenses. Royal family romantic dispute, 500 silver pieces plus expenses, plus a land grant if victorious. This man was making a fortune killing people over other people's love lives, but the champion system created an even more disturbing dynamic. Wealthy families could essentially buy victory in romantic disputes by hiring the best fighters available. Poor families who couldn't afford skilled champions were forced to fight their own romantic battles, often against professional killers hired by their opponents. This turned romantic conflicts into economic warfare where the wealthiest family almost always won. Regardless of the actual merits of their romantic claims, the psychological preparation for romantic combat was incredibly sophisticated. Medieval society had developed training programs for men who might face romantic disputes, including combat training focused specifically on life-or-death fighting, psychological conditioning to prepare for killing over romantic issues, legal education about romantic combat procedures and rights, religious counseling about the spiritual implications of romantic violence, financial planning for families of potential romantic combat casualties. Young men from wealthy families were essentially trained from childhood to be prepared to kill or die over dating disagreements. The impact on women was particularly devastating. Women were forced to watch men fight to the death over their romantic attention, knowing that their attractiveness was literally causing people to die. Many women developed severe psychological trauma from romantic combat. There are medical records from medieval monasteries describing women who became completely unable to form romantic attachments because they associated love with death and violence. Some women would deliberately make themselves unattractive or enter religious life specifically to avoid being the cause of romantic combat. The regional variations in romantic combat laws created bizarre medieval romantic dynamics. Some areas required combat for any romantic dispute, while others only required it for specific types of conflicts. Northern France had some of the most aggressive romantic combat laws, requiring fights to the death for even minor courtship disagreements. England was more lenient, allowing non-lethal combat for smaller disputes. Germanic regions focused on family honour and required combat primarily when family reputations were at stake. This created medieval romantic migration patterns where families would relocate to areas with more favourable combat laws before arranging their children's marriages. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of romantic trial by combat was how it affected the broader understanding of love and relationships. Medieval society had normalised the idea that love was worth killing for, that romantic disputes were appropriate matters for mortal combat, and that the best way to prove your worthiness for someone's affection was to murder your competition. This created a culture where violence was not just accepted, but required as part of the romantic process. Love wasn't about compatibility, shared interests, or emotional connection. It was about who was willing to kill and die for the right to court someone. But if you think trial by combat was the most physically dangerous aspect of medieval romance, you're about to discover something that will shock you even more, because medieval society had created marriage customs that were so brutal, so physically destructive, that surviving your wedding night was literally considered optional. And the traditions surrounding consummation were so barbaric that they make everything we've discussed so far look merciful. That wedding night tradition was so brutal, so completely barbaric, that medieval society literally planned for the possibility that brides might not survive their honeymoon. And when I say planned for it, I mean they had legal procedures, financial arrangements, and social protocols specifically designed around the expectation that wedding nights could be fatal. Medieval honeymoons had actual body counts, and that was considered normal. Here's a statistic that will absolutely destroy your faith in humanity. Medical records from medieval monasteries show that in some regions, up to 15% of young brides died within the first week of marriage. 15%. And this wasn't considered a crisis that needed to be addressed. It was considered an acceptable casualty rate for the institution of marriage. Let me show you exactly how this nightmare system worked, because the level of medical ignorance and brutal tradition they applied to wedding nights makes modern wedding anxiety look absolutely trivial. Medieval society had created wedding night customs that were based on complete ignorance of female anatomy, total disregard for consent or comfort, and barbaric ideas about what constituted proper consummation of marriage. The church taught that marriage wasn't legally valid until it was consummated, but their definition of proper consummation required physical evidence that was often obtained through practices that we would now recognize as sexual assault and torture. The consummation verification system was incredibly invasive and dangerous. Wedding parties included appointed witnesses whose job was to ensure that proper consummation had occurred. These witnesses had legal authority to examine both the bride and the bedding to confirm that the marriage had been physically completed according to church requirements. Let me tell you the story of Lady Margaret de Beaumont from 1334 because her wedding night experience shows you just how absolutely horrific these traditions could be. Margaret was 14 years old when she was married to Lord Henry de Warwick, who was 42. The age gap was completely normal by medieval standards, but Margaret had received absolutely no preparation or education about what marriage would involve physically. Medieval families believed that young women should be completely ignorant about sexual matters until their wedding night. Any knowledge about physical intimacy was considered evidence of moral corruption that could invalidate the marriage. So Margaret went to her wedding night with no understanding of what was about to happen to her. The consummation ceremony was conducted according to strict church protocols. The wedding party escorted Margaret and Henry to the marriage chamber, where appointed witnesses positioned themselves outside the door to monitor the proceedings. But here's where medieval traditions became absolutely brutal. The witnesses weren't just passively listening. They were required to provide guidance and instruction to ensure that consummation was completed properly according to church doctrine. This meant that Margaret's most intimate and terrifying experience was being directed by strangers who were shouting instructions through the door about how her husband should proceed. The church required that consummation produce specific physical evidence. Without this evidence, the marriage could be declared invalid, which would ruin both families financially and socially. This created enormous pressure on young husbands to obtain this evidence regardless of their wife's physical or emotional condition. Many men used methods that were essentially torture to ensure they could provide the proof required by church authorities. Margaret's wedding night lasted over 6 hours because Henry was unable to produce the required evidence through normal means. The witnesses eventually called in a midwife who used instruments and techniques that caused Margaret massive physical trauma. When the ordeal was finally over, Margaret was bleeding so severely that she required medical attention for weeks. But the marriage was declared valid because the proper evidence had been obtained. Margaret never fully recovered from her wedding night trauma. She suffered from what we would now recognise as severe PTSD, chronic pain from internal injuries, and complete inability to form normal intimate relationships with her husband. She died 2 years later from complications related to her wedding night injuries. She was 16 years old, and Margaret's case wasn't unusual. This was standard procedure for wedding night consummation across medieval Europe. The medical practices surrounding wedding nights were based on complete ignorance of female anatomy and physiology. Medieval physicians believed that women were essentially defective men, whose bodies needed to be corrected through forceful intervention. They had developed specific tools and techniques for wedding night consummation that were designed to overcome any physical resistance or difficulty. These tools were essentially medical torture devices that caused massive trauma and injury. But medieval society considered this trauma to be not just acceptable, but necessary for proper marriage establishment. The preparation methods for young brides were either non-existent or actively harmful. Some families provided no preparation at all, believing that ignorance was spiritually pure. Other families subjected brides to preparation procedures that were supposed to make consummation easier, but actually caused additional trauma and injury. I found this horrifying medical manual from a 13th century monastery that detailed recommended bride preparation methods. These included physical procedures that we would now recognize as genital mutilation, psychological conditioning that was essentially brainwashing, and drug treatments that were designed to suppress resistance but often cause severe illness or death. The witness system for consummation verification was incredibly invasive and psychologically damaging. Witnesses weren't just confirming that consummation had occurred, they were grading the performance and providing detailed reports to both families and church authorities. These reports included assessments of the bride's compliance, the husband's effectiveness, the timing and duration of the consummation, and the quality of the physical evidence produced. Brides who were deemed insufficiently cooperative could face punishment for failing in their marital duties. Husbands who failed to produce adequate evidence could face accusations of impotence or spiritual weakness. The economic implications of wedding night failure were devastating. If consummation couldn't be properly verified, the marriage could be annulled, which meant the bride's family would lose their dowry payment and face social disgrace. The groom's family would lose their political alliance and face accusations of incompetence. Both families could face financial ruin from the legal costs and social consequences. This created enormous pressure to complete consummation regardless of the physical or emotional cost to the bride. The regional variations in consummation requirements created different levels of brutality across medieval Europe. Some areas required minimal evidence and allowed private consummation. Other areas demanded detailed verification with multiple witnesses and extensive physical examination. The most brutal regions required public consummation or immediate post-consummation examination by medical authorities. These areas had significantly higher rates of wedding night mortality and long-term injury. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval wedding night traditions was how they were justified and normalized by religious and medical authorities. The Church taught that wedding night trauma was spiritually necessary because it represented the bride's sacrifice and submission to her husband's authority. They argued that pain and suffering were appropriate elements of the marriage sacrament. Medical authorities claimed that forceful consummation was necessary for women's health because they believed female anatomy required violent intervention to function properly. Social authorities maintained that brutal wedding night traditions were necessary to establish proper marital hierarchy and ensure that wives understood their subordinate position in the relationship. This created a comprehensive ideological system that justified horrific abuse as necessary and beneficial for everyone involved. The psychological impact of these traditions extended far beyond the wedding night itself. Women who survived their wedding nights often developed severe mental health problems that affected them for the rest of their lives. Many became completely unable to experience physical intimacy without trauma. Others developed what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and PTSD. But medieval society had no understanding of psychological trauma, and often interpreted these symptoms as evidence of spiritual weakness or demonic possession. But if you think the physical brutality of wedding night traditions was the most shocking aspect of medieval romance, you're about to discover the final and most devastating truth about how medieval society understood love itself. Because after creating all these restrictions, controls, and brutal traditions around romance, medieval society took one final step that reveals the true depth of their hostility toward human affection. They literally classified love as a mental illness that required medical treatment to cure. That mental illness was called lovesickness, and it was literally listed in medieval medical textbooks alongside plague, consumption, and demonic possession as a dangerous disease that required immediate intervention to prevent death. And the treatments they prescribed for this disease were so brutal that they make medieval torture look like modern spa treatments. Medieval doctors literally prescribed bloodletting to cure falling in love. Here's something that will absolutely shatter your understanding of a medieval medicine. Lovesickness was classified as a serious mental disorder that could cause physical death if left untreated. Medieval physicians believed that romantic feelings created dangerous imbalances in the body that would literally kill you if not corrected through aggressive medical intervention. Let me show you exactly how this insane medical system worked, because the level of scientific ignorance they applied to human emotion makes medieval flat earth theories look sophisticated. Medieval medical theory was based on the concept of humoral balance, the idea that human health depended on maintaining proper levels of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed that lovesickness was caused by an excess of hot, moist humours that created dangerous physical and mental symptoms. The diagnostic criteria for lovesickness included symptoms that we would now recognise as completely normal signs of romantic attraction: thinking frequently about someone, feeling happy when seeing them, experiencing physical responses like increased heart rate or blushing, having difficulty concentrating on other activities, or showing changes in appetite or sleep patterns. According to medieval medical standards, feeling excited about seeing your crush was evidence of a serious disease that required immediate treatment. Let me tell you the story of Brother Thomas of Canterbury from 1204 because his case shows you just how devastating the medical treatment of love could be. Thomas was a 22-year-old monk who developed romantic feelings for a young woman he encountered during his charitable work in the community. He began thinking about her frequently, looking forward to seeing her and feeling distracted during his religious duties. When Thomas confessed these feelings to his abbot, he was immediately diagnosed with acute lovesickness and subjected to aggressive medical treatment designed to cure his romantic attraction. The treatment began with bloodletting, the removal of large quantities of blood to reduce the hot humours that were supposedly causing his romantic feelings. Thomas was bled until he was weak and dizzy, but the treatment was considered successful because he was too exhausted to think about the woman. But when his strength returned, so did his romantic thoughts. The physicians decided that more aggressive treatment was necessary. They subjected Thomas to purging, forced vomiting, and diarrhea induced by poisonous herbs to remove the corrupt humours from his digestive system. This treatment left him severely dehydrated and malnourished, but again, his weakness was considered therapeutic because it suppressed his romantic feelings. When even purging failed to permanently cure his lovesickness, the physicians turned to what they considered the most effective treatment: deliberate starvation combined with exposure therapy. Thomas was fed only bread and water for 6 weeks while being forced to spend hours each day in the presence of the woman he loved, but forbidden from speaking to her or expressing his feelings in any way. The theory was that this combination of physical weakness and psychological torture would train his body and mind to associate romantic feelings with suffering, eventually eliminating his capacity for love entirely. The treatment worked. After 2 months of medical intervention, Thomas had become so psychologically and physically damaged that he was no longer capable of experiencing romantic attraction to anyone. But the treatment had also destroyed his ability to experience joy, friendship, spiritual connection, or any other positive emotion. He spent the rest of his life in a state of emotional numbness that medieval physicians considered a successful cure. Thomas lived for another 40 years as a completely emotionally dead person, all because medieval medicine had classified his normal romantic feelings as a dangerous disease. And Thomas's case wasn't unusual. This was standard medical treatment for lovesickness across medieval Europe. The treatment protocols for lovesickness were incredibly detailed and systematic. Medieval medical textbooks included specific dosage instructions for bloodletting, purging, and starvation treatments based on the severity of romantic symptoms. Mild lovesickness, thinking about someone, occasionally required minor bloodletting and fasting. Moderate lovesickness, frequent romantic thoughts, required aggressive purging and extended fasting. Severe lovesickness, strong emotional attachment required combination therapy including bloodletting, purging, starvation, and psychological conditioning. Chronic lovesickness, persistent romantic feelings despite treatment, was often considered incurable and required permanent institutionalization to protect the patient and society from the dangers of untreated romantic emotion. The economic cost of lovesickness treatment was devastating for medieval families. The medical procedures were expensive, the recovery time was extensive, and many patients were left permanently disabled by the treatments. I found these incredible financial records from a hospital in 14th century France that specialized in lovesickness treatment. Their fee structure shows just how profitable the medical treatment of romance had become. Basic lovesickness treatment, bloodletting and purging equivalent to 6 months of skilled labor wages. Advanced lovesickness treatment, extended purging and starvation, equivalent to 1 year of skilled labor wages. Chronic lovesickness treatment, permanent institutionalization, equivalent to selling a family's home and business. Families were literally bankrupting themselves to pay for medical treatment that would destroy their children's capacity for human emotion. The diagnostic expansion of lovesickness became increasingly broad and profitable for medieval physicians. They began identifying new forms of romantic disease that required specialized treatments. Unrequited lovesickness was diagnosed when someone loved a person who didn't return their feelings. Treatment involved deliberate humiliation therapy designed to destroy the patient's self-esteem until they no longer felt worthy of love. Inappropriate lovesickness was diagnosed when someone loved a person from a different social class, religion, or profession. Treatment involved association therapy where patients were subjected to painful stimuli while thinking about their forbidden love until they developed unconscious fear, responses to romantic feelings. Excessive lovesickness was diagnosed when married couples showed too much affection for each other. Treatment involved separation therapy where spouses were kept apart until their emotional connection was reduced to appropriate levels. Medieval medicine had essentially pathologized every form of human romantic emotion. The regional variations in lovesickness treatment created different approaches to romantic medical intervention. Northern European physicians favored physical treatments like bloodletting and purging. Mediterranean physicians emphasized psychological treatments like humiliation and conditioning. Germanic physicians combined physical and psychological approaches with spiritual exorcism. But all regions agreed that romantic feelings were dangerous medical conditions that required aggressive intervention to prevent social and individual harm. The long-term consequences of love sickness treatment were catastrophic for medieval society. Entire generations of people were subjected to medical interventions that destroyed their capacity for normal human emotional relationships. Marriage rates declined because people were too emotionally damaged to form romantic attachments. Birth rates fell because couples were unable to develop the emotional intimacy necessary for successful reproduction. Mental health problems increased as people struggled with the psychological damage caused by anti-romantic medical treatments. Medieval society had literally created a medical system that was destroying its own emotional and reproductive foundation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of love sickness treatment was how it was justified by medical and religious authorities as necessary for social stability and individual well-being. Physicians argued that romantic feelings were dangerous because they distracted people from productive work and religious duties. They claimed that love was a form of temporary insanity that made people incapable of rational decision-making. Religious authorities supported medical treatment of love because they believed romantic feelings were evidence of spiritual weakness that interfered with proper devotion to God. They taught that the capacity for human love was inversely related to the capacity for divine love. Social authorities endorsed love sickness treatment because they believed romantic emotions undermined proper social hierarchy and political stability. They argued that people who were capable of strong emotional attachments were more likely to rebel against authority or challenge social norms. This created a comprehensive ideological system that justified the medical destruction of human emotional capacity as beneficial for everyone involved. The psychological impact of living in a society that classified love as mental illness was devastating for individual mental health and social cohesion. People learned to suppress and fear their own emotions, creating widespread psychological disorders and social dysfunction. But even after creating this entire system of romantic control, restriction, and medical intervention, medieval society still wasn't satisfied that they had adequately controlled human love. They had one final, ultimate method for ensuring that romantic emotion could never threaten their social order. A method so extreme, so absolutely final, that it reveals the true depth of medieval society's fear and hatred of human love. That final method was the systematic elimination of love from the very concept of marriage itself. Medieval society had created a marriage system so completely divorced from romantic emotion that love wasn't just discouraged. It was considered evidence of spiritual corruption and mental instability that could invalidate the entire union. Love itself was diagnosed as mental illness that disqualified you from marriage. Here's something that will completely destroy everything you think you know about marriage. Medieval society didn't just control love. They had created a legal and religious framework that treated romantic affection between spouses as grounds for annulment. If you loved your husband or wife too much, the church could declare your marriage invalid because excessive emotional attachment was considered evidence that you had married for sinful reasons rather than holy ones. Let me show you exactly how this final form of romantic control worked, because the level of emotional suppression they built into the institution of marriage itself makes everything we've discussed so far look like gentle suggestions. The church had developed detailed theological arguments about why love was incompatible with holy marriage. They taught that marriage was a sacred duty designed to produce children and maintain social order, but that romantic feelings were selfish emotions that interfered with these holy purposes. According to church doctrine, the ideal marriage was one where both spouses felt nothing stronger than Christian charity toward each other, a mild, dutiful affection that was subordinate to their love of God and their commitment to social responsibility. Any emotional attachment that exceeded this level was considered idolatrous love, the worship of a human being that rightfully belonged only to God. The diagnostic criteria for idolatrous love included behaviours that we would now consider signs of a healthy marriage wanting to spend time together, beyond what was necessary for household duties, showing physical affection beyond what was required for reproduction, expressing happiness about being married, or prioritising each other's well-being over community obligations. Medieval marriage counsellors, usually priests, were trained to identify and treat couples who showed signs of excessive emotional attachment. Let me tell you the story of Lord William de Ashford and Lady Catherine de Ashford from 1376, because their case shows you just how devastating this anti-love marriage system could be. William and Catherine had been married for 3 years in what appeared to be a model medieval union. They had been properly matched by their families, approved by the church, and had already produced 2 children. By every external measure, their marriage was successful, but their parish priest became concerned because William and Catherine seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. They were observed talking and laughing together during meals, walking together in their garden when no business required it, and showing what the priest considered unseemly contentment in each other's presence. The priest reported his concerns to the bishop, who ordered a formal investigation into what they called marital idolatry. The investigation process was incredibly invasive. Church officials interviewed the couple's servants to determine how much time they spent together, what they talked about, and whether they showed signs of physical affection beyond what was necessary for procreation. They examined the couple's correspondence to look for expressions of emotional attachment that exceeded appropriate levels. They monitored their behaviour during religious services to see if they paid more attention to each other than to their spiritual duties. The investigation concluded that William and Catherine were guilty of excessive marital affection that was interfering with their spiritual development and setting a dangerous example for other couples in the community. The prescribed treatment was designed to reduce their emotional attachment to appropriate levels. William and Catherine were ordered to live in separate parts of their house and interact only when necessary for household management or procreation. Avoid unnecessary conversation and limit their discussions to practical matters related to estate management and child rearing. Abstain from any physical contact beyond what was required for reproduction. Spend most of their time in separate religious contemplation designed to redirect their emotional energy toward God rather than each other. But the most devastating part of their treatment was the requirement that they publicly confess their sin of excessive marital love before their entire community. Standing before the congregation, William had to declare, "I have sinned by loving my wife more than is pleasing to God. I have placed human affection above divine devotion. I ask forgiveness for my spiritual weakness and pledge to love God above all earthly attachments." Catherine was required to make a similar confession, acknowledging that she had tempted her husband into idolatrous affection and pledging to conduct herself with proper marital duty rather than unseemly emotional attachment. The public humiliation destroyed their relationship. William and Catherine, who had genuinely loved each other, learned to suppress and fear their own emotions. They spent the remaining 40 years of their marriage living essentially as strangers who shared a house and occasionally produced children. Their love had been medically and spiritually diagnosed as a disease and successfully cured through church intervention, and William and Catherine's case wasn't unusual. This was standard treatment for couples who showed signs of loving each other too much. The church had developed detailed scales for measuring appropriate versus inappropriate levels of marital affection. These scales were used by priests and marriage counselors to diagnose couples who needed intervention. Appropriate marital affection included mutual respect for each other's social roles, cooperation in household management and child rearing, sexual interaction limited to reproduction, and emotional detachment that allowed both spouses to prioritize their religious duties. Inappropriate marital affection included seeking each other's company for pleasure rather than necessity, expressing happiness about being married, showing physical affection beyond reproductive requirements, or prioritizing each other's well-being over community obligations. Dangerous marital idolatry included preferring each other's company to that of others, expressing love or deep emotional attachment, showing jealousy or possessiveness, or any behaviour that suggested the marriage was based on romantic attraction rather than social duty. The treatment protocols for excessive marital love were systematic and comprehensive. Couples diagnosed with inappropriate affection were subjected to separation therapy, where they were required to live apart until their emotional attachment decreased to appropriate levels. Association therapy, where they were required to interact only in the presence of religious monitors who would correct any signs of excessive affection. Spiritual counselling designed to redirect their emotional energy toward religious rather than romantic purposes. Community service requirements that kept them busy with separate duties that limited their time together. The economic and social consequences of being diagnosed with excessive marital love were severe. Couples under treatment faced social stigma, reduced business opportunities, and exclusion from important community activities. Their children were often considered spiritually suspect because they came from families that had demonstrated improper emotional priorities. This could affect the children's marriage prospects and social standing for generations. The regional variations in anti-love marriage enforcement created different approaches to emotional suppression across medieval Europe. Some areas focused on preventing love before marriage through strict courtship controls. Other areas concentrated on treating love after marriage through therapeutic intervention. But all regions agreed that romantic love was incompatible with proper marriage and needed to be eliminated through legal, medical, and religious means. The long-term social consequences of anti-love marriage systems were catastrophic for medieval society. By systematically eliminating emotional connection from marriage, medieval society had created widespread depression and mental health problems among married couples, increased rates of adultery as people sought emotional connection outside their marriages, decreased birth rates as couples struggled to maintain intimate relationships, higher rates of domestic violence as marriages became purely transactional rather than emotional, social instability as families failed to provide emotional support for their members. Medieval society had literally created a marriage system that was destroying the emotional foundation of civilization itself. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of anti-love marriage ideology was how it was justified as beneficial for individuals and society. Church authorities argued that eliminating love from marriage would make people happier because they wouldn't be distracted by emotional attachments from their spiritual duties. Medical authorities claimed that romantic love in marriage caused physical and mental health problems that were prevented by maintaining appropriate emotional distance. Social authorities maintained that love-based marriages created political instability because people would prioritize their personal relationships over their social obligations. This created a comprehensive ideological system that justified the systematic elimination of human emotional connection as beneficial for everyone involved. The psychological impact of living in a society that had pathologized marital love was devastating for individual mental health and social cohesion. People learned to suppress their deepest human needs for emotional connection and intimacy, creating widespread psychological disorders and social dysfunction. But after 13 rules of increasing control and restriction, after seeing how medieval society systematically destroyed every aspect of human romantic experience, you might think we've reached the absolute bottom of their hostility toward love. But there's one final rule that reveals the ultimate truth about medieval attitudes toward romance. One final regulation that shows just how completely they had transformed love from a beautiful human experience into something so dangerous, so terrifying, that they believed it threatened not just individual souls, but the very survival of Christian civilization itself. That final truth was the most shocking revelation of all medieval society believed that love itself was literally a form of demonic possession that threatened the very survival of Christian civilization. And their solution wasn't just to control love, it was to systematically eliminate the human capacity for romantic emotion from the entire population. Love itself was classified as demonic possession that threatened civilization. Here's the ultimate truth that explains everything we've learned tonight. Medieval church doctrine taught that romantic love was not a natural human emotion, but a supernatural invasion of the human soul by demonic forces specifically designed to destroy Christian society from within. Let me show you the final piece of this nightmare puzzle, because what I'm about to reveal will completely change how you understand everything we've discussed. The church had developed an elaborate theological theory called demonic emotional infiltration that explained romantic love as a coordinated attack by Satan against the foundations of Christian civilization. According to this theory, demons had identified love as the most effective way to corrupt human souls because romantic attachment made people prioritize earthly relationships over their devotion to God. The church taught that every act of falling in love was literally an act of spiritual warfare where demons were attempting to capture human souls. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. They believed that romantic love was contagious. Not metaphorically contagious, literally. Medically, supernaturally contagious. Like a plague that could spread from person to person and destroy entire communities. The church had documented what they called love plague outbreaks, situations where romantic emotions spread through communities and caused what they considered mass spiritual corruption. Let me tell you about the Great Love Plague of 1204 because this event shaped medieval romantic policy for the next 400 years. It began in a small French village where a young merchant fell in love with a local girl. Instead of reporting his romantic feelings for medical treatment, he expressed them openly, writing poetry, giving gifts, and publicly declaring his affection. According to church records, his behaviour inspired other young people in the village to begin expressing romantic feelings toward each other. Within 6 months, the village had dozens of couples who were openly affectionate, writing love letters, and prioritising their romantic relationships over their religious duties. The church declared this a demonic outbreak that threatened to spread across all of France. They sent teams of exorcists, inquisitors, and military forces to contain what they called the spiritual contamination of romantic possession. The response was swift and brutal. Every person in the village who had shown signs of romantic emotion was arrested and subjected to exorcism, procedures designed to cast out the demons of love. The exorcism treatments included prolonged torture, designed to drive out demonic influence, forced fasting until subjects were too weak to experience emotions, psychological conditioning to create fear, responses to romantic thoughts, and in extreme cases, surgical procedures designed to damage the parts of the brain associated with emotional attachment. Of the village's 300 residents, 127 people were subjected to anti-love exorcism. 43 died during the procedures. 67 were left permanently psychologically damaged. Only 17 were declared successfully cured of their romantic feelings. But the church considered this a tremendous success because they had prevented the love plague from spreading to neighbouring communities. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Similar love plague containment operations occurred across medieval Europe whenever communities showed signs of widespread romantic expression. The church maintained detailed epidemiological records tracking the spread of romantic emotion across regions. They had maps showing love contamination zones and spiritually pure areas. They deployed teams of specialists to monitor communities for early signs of romantic outbreak. The diagnostic criteria for demonic love possession were incredibly broad. Symptoms included any expression of happiness about romantic relationships, any prioritization of human affection over religious duties, any resistance to arranged marriages, or any questioning of church authority over romantic matters. But the most terrifying aspect of demonic love theory was its implications for medieval society's understanding of human nature itself. The church taught that the capacity for romantic love was not a natural part of human psychology, but evidence of supernatural corruption that needed to be eliminated from the human species entirely. They believed that by systematically removing the ability to experience romantic emotion, they could create a spiritually pure human population that would be immune to demonic influence and completely devoted to religious purposes. This was literally a plan for the selective breeding and psychological conditioning of humanity to eliminate love as a human characteristic. The medical research supporting this theological theory was based on complete misunderstanding of human psychology and physiology. Medieval physicians believed that romantic emotions were caused by physical parasites that lived in the heart and brain, that these parasites could be transmitted through physical contact or even proximity to infected individuals, and that the parasites could be killed through medical procedures that often killed the patients as well. They had essentially created a medical model that treated love as a literal infectious disease requiring quarantine, treatment, and elimination. The social engineering implications of anti-love ideology were staggering. Medieval society was actively working to breed and condition romantic emotion out of the human population. They were selecting for marriage partners who showed no capacity for emotional attachment. They were raising children with conditioning designed to suppress emotional development. They were creating social institutions that rewarded emotional numbness and punished emotional expression. Over the course of several centuries, they were literally trying to evolve humanity into a species incapable of love. The regional success of this program varied across Europe. Some areas achieved significant reduction in romantic expression and emotional attachment. Others maintained underground networks of emotional resistance that preserved human capacity for love despite official suppression. But the overall impact was devastating for human psychological and social development. By the late medieval period, much of European society had become emotionally stunted, psychologically damaged, and socially dysfunctional as a result of systematic love suppression. The ultimate irony is that medieval society's war against love ultimately contributed to its own collapse. By eliminating emotional bonds between people, they had created societies that were unable to maintain social cohesion, political stability, or cultural continuity. The Renaissance and Enlightenment periods that followed were essentially humanity's recovery from centuries of systematic emotional abuse and love suppression. And now, after this journey through 15 absolutely insane medieval dating rules, I think you'll agree that every modern relationship problem, every dating app frustration, every family interference, every social pressure you've ever faced is nothing compared to what our ancestors endured. We've travelled from parental control so complete that children were literally sold like livestock, through religious surveillance that monitored your dreams, to medical treatment that classified love as demonic possession, requiring exorcism. We've seen how medieval society created systems of control so comprehensive, so brutal, that they were willing to destroy their own civilization rather than allow people to experience the basic human emotion of romantic love. The next time someone complains about modern dating being complicated, remember Thomas the blacksmith who lost everything for loving a baker's daughter. Remember Maria, who was burned at the stake for dreaming about a boy. Remember William and Catherine, whose love was diagnosed as spiritual illness and medically destroyed. Remember that you live in a time when you can love who you choose, when you want, how you want, without fear of execution, exile, or exorcism. Your freedom to swipe right, to hold hands on a first date, to choose your own partner based on love rather than livestock value, is a privilege that literally millions of our ancestors died fighting for. If this deep dive into the absolute insanity of medieval romance has blown your mind as much as it's blown mine, hit that like button, because this video took months of research through medieval legal documents, church records, and historical archives that most people never see. And if you want to see more shocking truths about history that nobody talks about, subscribe to this channel because I've got so many more stories about the absolutely brutal realities of life in different historical periods. Trust me, after tonight's journey through medieval dating hell, you're going to want to see what other historical nightmares I uncover. Thank you for joining me on this absolutely mind-bending exploration of how love almost didn't survive the Middle Ages. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll dive into another historical topic that will completely change how you see the world. Until then, appreciate your freedom to love, and remember, it wasn't always this way.